aren't familiar with warrant officers, the Air Force, we don't have them. I don't know a whole lot about them just because my only interaction with them was deployed with some of them in Afghanistan, and then very, very little interaction while I was still in. And so it's and Jeff, obviously you lived in this role for quite a while compared to my knowledge. So it's a position of a sort of a hybrid between officer and enlisted, but you don't generally have direct reports, is my understanding with a warrant, and they usually are more specialty type career fields. Or correct me if I'm totally off.
But yeah, no, I mean that's mostly right. That was the concept behind them. But the Army changes what it needs on the fly. So a lot of times, warrant officers were asked to also do double duty as platoon leaders. Or normally, you would have a lieutenant or a captain would serve in that function. Warrant officers, if there's a gap, the commander is looking at a warrant officer as a very vital person because they know we come with more experience than their typical lieutenant. And if they're looking at putting a person in a critical role where a lieutenant would normally go, they'll sometimes turn over to that warrant officer and say, hey, I know you can do this job better than this lieutenant. I want you in this job. So for warrant officers, even though the traditional method, we didn't have a lot of direct reports, a lot of times we end up doing a lot of direct reports just because commanders see the value in having us in positions of leadership. But yeah, we are the technical experts. We are in our chosen job career fields, and we are kind of a bridge between the commissioned officer side and the enlisted side, where we came from the enlisted ranks. We knew what it was to really have a good foundation in that MOS or that job background, and we're also kind of able to speak officer talk, if you will, to a degree. So we're that bridge, but we're also recognized as subject matter experts in our technical expertise. And it's funny because I would say the exact same thing I used to say as an E-6. And as an E-6, the commander would be like, okay, that's good, Sergeant. We'll keep that under advisement. Then when you say the same thing as a warrant officer, suddenly it's like something magical happened and you know more.
This
And
enlightened
your
person just
word has
dropped
more
some
weight.
wisdom.
Yeah, and everybody just jumps to what you said, but that's a dual-edged sword too because it can really impact your reputation if you're not careful with that. So you always have to be careful what you advise and how you tell a commander something and make sure that what you're saying is accurate.
So knowing, just doing some research about warrants since I've met you, it seems like it's a real thin climb. Like there's not a whole lot of depth in those ranks. I think there's in the whole army. I think there's like 650 CW5s, and it kind of
Yeah.
tables off as you go down the rank, or tables up to that as you go down the ranks. But was it a true experience for you, like you mentioned before, about going into that career had more opportunity for you opposed to going up the enlisted route, or?
It was. I mean, because when you go to professional schools as a non-commissioned officer, there might be one or two other individuals in the class that are competitive peers. And the rest of the people, they're just trying to check the box and say they went to the school.
Right.
But when I went to warrant officer candidate school and a lot of my other warrant officer schools, you have to remember that every warrant officer that's there was cream of the crop in their field.
Yeah.
And that's why they were selected to become a warrant officer. So my whole class of 14 of us, so my 13 other peers in my basic course, warrant officer basic course, they were all stellar NCOs in the fields that they came from. So being able to place in the top 10 percentile of that peer group really was an accomplishment because every single one of these individuals are high performers. So it really kind of, military kind of gives you that structure where you can thrive in that environment. And I mean, luckily for me, it was the environment I did well in. So.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's highly competitive. It's highly competitive, and the higher you go up in rank, it's highly competitive as well. And the Army always changes what it needs, what it wants, and what it's looking at. So yeah, your timing's got to be great, your performance has to be great, and you have to be lucky.
So what's resonating from that is, if with it being highly competitive, someone wants to really be challenged. It's almost, yeah. There's three different routes to go in the Army. There's the enlisted, there's officer, then there's kind of that middle ground with the warrant. But it sounds like, at least my experience with officers, it doesn't really become highly competitive until you get like lieutenant colonel and above. But as a warrant, it's probably pretty interesting once you get like CW3 and, and above that level. It's probably a grudge fest, I would assume, just how they're all the go getters.
Yeah, it's. I mean, even being selected for warrant officer is pretty competitive in your field because I remember there would be 7 slots for our selection, and there would be 20 plus applicants. And so, in that kind of environment, somebody's going to get their feelings hurt.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I talked to a bunch of older NCOs I still stay in contact with who are in this area where I retired at, and they will tell me, man, I put a warrant officer packet in and I never got selected. And these were guys that I looked at when I was a young soldier, knowing that these NCOs they were top performers at the time, but for whatever reason they weren't selected. So yeah, it is a competitive field. So selection all the way up through the different promotions at the various levels is something to be proud of, no matter where somebody stops at. I mean, it's something to be proud of.
So, as someone that doesn't know a whole lot about how long it takes, what is that time frame like from when you first become a CW1 to go climbing up those ranks? What was your experience like in that?
So it's pretty standard is that once you become a warrant officer, 2 years after the date, there's typically an automatic promotion that'll happen to CW2, Chief Warrant Officer 2. Unless you do something wrong, in which case the first O5 or lieutenant colonel can do a letter recommending you not get promoted, and you will actually either revert back to your enlisted rank or you will end up getting a pink slip out of the Army. But for everybody, for most people, it's 2 years is a mandatory promotion or kind of an automatic promotion to CW2 at 2 years. And then the time cycles to the next promotion are typically a 4-year cycle for technical warrant officers. For aviation warrant officers, it's typically a 5 to 6 year cycle.
Much longer.
And
wow.
the reason for that is you can have somebody fresh off the streets, what we used to call high school to flight school kind of individual. And you automatically make him a W-2 2 years in. So he's about 20, 22-ish maybe. And then if they were to make him a W-3 at 26 years, there's this thing where they would promote them a little too quick before they got to the 20-year mark. So they extended out the timeline with the aviation warrant officers to make their cycles a little bit longer than ours as on the tech side. So it's typically every 4 years you're being assessed for your next rank. But the Army got to a point where they started looking at us at the 3-year mark as opposed to the 4-year mark. So my promotion to W3 happened a year earlier than I thought it was going to happen. And likewise, my promotion to W4 I was essentially assessed at the 3-year mark and selected and then promoted right when I hit that 4-year mark. So the Army changed how they did business a little bit with that. So it's my last 17 years as a warrant officer, wrapping up service. So
That's awesome. Yeah, that's as you and I've spoke, I'm envious that there wasn't that sort of career path and option in my branch of service. It's I feel like there was an opportunity missed for leadership within that, especially coming out of the service and having that experience and that exposure to the higher ranking people than you would as an enlisted, and really learn kind of how to cut your teeth in there. I think is an amazing experience, at least for all the warrants that I've met. They've come across very clean and polished compared to someone that just did 20 years and got out. It's a really cool way to spend your time in public service. So that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that with us.
yeah, I wish the Air Force would bring warrant officers out. I mean, there's been talks about it my whole career, and lately there's been more talks about it given some of the new career fields out there. But the Air Force, because they don't have warrant officers, we don't get tied to joint manning funds because not all the services have them. And at this point, it's just the Air Force that's a holdout on that. And if they would do that, then it would open pots of money for progression for warrant officers across all the services because they can tie it to joint manning funds.
Hey, who
But
knows? Maybe Space Force might do it, and then they would technically have it. So
Space Force might, yeah. A Space Force warrant officer.
they apparently they have their kind of their first basic training going on right now, and their first those first, and they call them Guardians, is their acronym, or the nomenclature for them is Guardians, and their first couple of batches of those guys are going through. I was watching some videos on their basic training and kind of snickering about how even compared to the Air Force, I know we have it way, way, way easier than everyone else, but it's kind of laughable, their obstacle courses and things like that, even compared to what we had. So
Yeah,
definitely, they're not looking for people that are very physically competent in that branch, which makes sense. I mean, it's you're not exactly storming beaches or kicking in doors in that branch of service. So